As you all of us may know, the subject before us is self-effort and divine grace in spiritual life. Now, apparently, there is a little contradiction between these two terms. If spiritual success, if success in spiritual life depends upon the grace of God, then is there any place for our own effort in spiritual life? And if everything depends upon our own effort, then is there any place for divine grace? There is always an apparent contradiction. And you find this contradiction is resolved the moment you step into practical spiritual life. This contradiction cannot be resolved at the philosophical or at the theoretical level. The moment you enter spiritual life, then we realize there is absolutely no contradiction. There are a few classical examples from the lives and teachings of great spiritual personalities which highlight this reconciliation between self-effort and divine grace. One example, the first example that I want to present before you is from the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. Now, Sri Ramakrishna says, if you want to cross a river, you have to make use of a boat. But if the boat is tied to the anchor, and then if you just sit in a boat, you won't reach the other bank. So first you have to untie the anchor, you have to free the boat, and then you have to row the boat for some time till it reaches the middle part of the river. And then you can make use of the breeze, the wind that is blowing. But if you sit on the bank of the river, and if you just express a desire to cross the river, you cannot make use of this wind that is blowing. Now, this wind that is blowing is the grace of God. And your effort to untie this boat and your effort involved in rowing till the boat reaches the middle of the river, these two activities constitute self-effort. So, self-effort is essential. And once we make our own effort, then you find that divine grace also plays its role in spiritual life. Another example is found in the Gita. Gita has got 700 verses divided into 18 chapters. And it deals with a number of topics. Philosophical ideas, spiritual ideas, high metaphysical thinking, all that you find in the Gita. Sri Krishna teaches Arjuna the principles of Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, how to make use of different temperaments for spiritual success. And then, after teaching Arjuna all the different aspects of yoga, all the different spiritual philosophical ideas, then there is a verse in the 18th chapter, 66th verse, Sarva dharman parityajya mamekam saranam vraja aham tva sarva papebhyo mokshayishyami ma shucha. It's a very interesting verse. The verse is this, the meaning is this. You have already learned the dynamics of yoga, action, meditation, philosophy, everything. So a lot of effort is involved. Sri Krishna teaches so many things to Arjuna, and his disciple listens with great attention. And after teaching all days, Krishna tells, now you surrender all your duties and responsibilities to me and depend upon divine grace. Now, Krishna doesn't ask Arjuna to surrender at the beginning itself. In fact, Sri Krishna asks Arjuna to work. First he says, give up laziness and ignorance and work with desire. And then he says, work with the desire, action with desire and attachment has some problems. So it's better to work, to do your action without desire, with perfect non-attachment. And then a lot of philosophical ideas are taught. After teaching all days, Krishna tells him, the teacher of Gita tells his disciple, you surrender all your duties and responsibilities to me and depend upon the divine grace. So you can find self-effort is involved. Without self-effort, you won't understand the value, the relevance, the significance of divine grace. Without making our own effort, and through that effort, we must make ourselves grace-worthy, worthy of grace of God. So it is the human effort that makes us worthy, deserving of God's grace. And once we have become worthy of God's grace, then we will understand the true meaning, relevance and significance of God's grace. So that means there is absolutely no contradiction between self-effort and divine grace. From the highest point of view, self-effort also is a part of divine grace. An example may be found in the teachings of a great Christian saint, Saint Teresa of Avila. She gives a very graphic, a classic description of the reconciliation of self-effort on the one hand, divine grace on the other, in practical spiritual life. First, she mentions a garden. Suppose a farmer has to irrigate his garden. But before watering the garden, he will have to remove the weeds, the grass, all the undesirable growth in the garden. And then the soil should be made ready. And once you have made the soil ready for irrigation, then you have to bring water. How do you bring water? There may be a well nearby. You can bring water with using buckets. It involves a lot of self-effort. Or there may be a river nearby. You have to dig a canal to bring water. That also involves self-effort. Or maybe in those days they were using water mills. That also involves self-effort. Well, suppose it rains. If it rains heavily, then you won't have to bring water from the well. You won't have to bring water from the river through a canal. You won't have to use water mill. You can sit quiet, but before that you must make the soil ready for irrigation. And then if there is the grace of God, it may rain, so you can avoid all this self-effort. You need not bring water from the canal, through the canal, from the river, or from the well. You can sit quiet when it rains, when it starts raining. But one effort cannot be avoided. What is the effort? First of all, you have to remove the weeds, the grass, the unnecessary growth in the garden. Without removing weeds, if it starts raining, then weeds and grass also may grow, and then the rainfall will not have its expected result. So, the great Saint Teresa of Avila says, if it starts raining, it is like the divine grace. But divine grace will not come unless we prepare ourselves for the divine grace. And this preparation involves some amount of self-effort. And if you are given grace abundantly, without any effort on your part, you won't be able to recognize or understand the real worth or relevance of divine grace. And this idea was explained when a disciple put a question to Swami Brahmanandaji, who was one of the most eminent disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. The Swami was a highly evolved person. He was considered to be as a realized person. So everyone knew that he had the experience of samadhi, the highest transcendental mystical experience. But then he was all the time doing japa. He was all the time engaged in spiritual practices. All the time. So one of his disciples asked the Swami, see, Swamiji, you are Swami Brahmananda. You are already an enlightened spiritual personality. You have already attained your goal. So why are you still engaged in spiritual practices? Then Brahmanandaji replied, which again gives an insight into the true significance of self-effort and also divine grace. He said, what we earn is ours. What we are given may not necessarily be ours. So, Sri Ramakrishna has given me everything. Sri Ramakrishna had trained Brahmanandaji in spiritual life. That is true. But to receive the blessing that Sri Ramakrishna had given me, to understand it and to preserve it, I have to make my own effort. So, in order to make himself worthy of Sri Ramakrishna's grace and blessings, Brahmanandaji was engaged in spiritual practices all the time. So, grace doesn't come unasked. Grace really becomes meaningful in spiritual life only if it is combined with self-effort. This is one of the greatest examples where you find that grace and self-effort are reconciled. Sometimes in spiritual life, we may have to face many obstacles. The main problem in spiritual life is duplicity of mind. This idea is expressed in innumerable spiritual classics, devotional classics. In classics, in many of the Christian mystical literature, like the writings of Meister Eckhart, Saint Teresa of Avila, and also in the great devotional classics of Vedantic tradition, Narada's Bhakti Sutras and all that. What really happens, we pray, but prayer doesn't work. That's because we have already formed different layers in our mind. Different layers. So we have something in our mind and we express something else, and even we do something else. That means so many layers, artificial layers, we have already formed in our mind. So when we pray, the prayer itself becomes a mechanical action. Gandhiji says we have to open our heart. Then divine grace flows into our heart. That's Gandhiji's definition of prayer. But for opening the heart should have only one layer. If it has got so many different artificial layers, what happens? The grace comes, but it stops at the doorsteps of our mind, of our life. So, this is one obstacle. Another obstacle in spiritual life is our identification with material comforts, secular comforts, empirical achievements, and then the pride that goes along with that. Pride in wealth, pride in learning, pedigree, all these constitute some of the obstacles. But if a devotee is sincere, God will himself involve and he will himself interfere and remove these obstacles from the path of the path of the devotee. So there is an ancient verse which says, God makes a statement, a great promise. Those whom I really want to bless, those whom I really want to grant grace, I myself remove those obstacles. The verse is this, Yasya anugraham ichchami tasya vittam haramyaham bandhavaischa viyogena brisham bhavadi dukkhidaha tena dukkhena samtrupto yadi mam na parityajet tam prasadam karishyami yad devairabi sudurlabham. If I interpret this verse, we'll understand the deeper practical significance of ideas contained in this verse in spiritual life. Those whom I really want to bless, those to whom I want to give my grace, God himself says, I remove all the wealth from him. A devotee who becomes too much attached to his wealth and too proud of his wealth, I remove the wealth from him. But this, God shows this grace only towards a devotee whom he really wants to bless. On the other hand, if God thinks, well, let him play with whatever little toys he has got and let him enjoy little, I need not interfere, then we will have plenty of wealth, plenty of comforts, and we'll forget everything about it. We'll get swept off our feet by the glamour of secular comforts. But if God has a soft corner for us, if God really wants to bless us, then what happens? Tasya vittam haramyaham. I steal his wealth. That's the literal translation. Which means I take away, I remove wealth from him. I take away all the wealth from him. So God doesn't give you too much wealth if you are attached to wealth, if you're proud of your wealth, and if he really wants to bless you. So what he does, he makes you a pauper. Because then, when you are freed, liberated from too much of attachment to wealth and ego, then God interferes and gives you some blows. And these blows make you open your eyes and make you aware of the importance of divine grace. So, whom I want to bless, I remove all the wealth from him. If he is too much attached to wealth. Because he doesn't want God, he wants wealth. But God has got some soft corner. So he removes all the wealth. And then what he does? He removes from him all his friends also. His friends turn against him. Then he will be forced to turn to God. Otherwise, when we are surrounded by friends and admirers and flatterers, sycophants, as Sri Ramakrishna says in the Gospel, we forget God. In fact, he refers to one of his devotees, a wealthy man. Then you don't remain surrounded by these hypocrites and flatterers. Their company makes you forget God. That's one instruction is there. One instruction is given by Sri Ramakrishna. So, first he removes all the wealth and comforts from you if you are attached too much to wealth and comfort. If you are too egoistic of your external achievements. And then if you are too proud of your admirers, too much attached to your admirers, which attachment takes you away from God, farther and farther away from God, then God removes all those admirers and friends from you. You are left alone. That's the meaning of the second verse. And still, if you are bankrupt, if you are isolated, if you are alone, still if you are attached to God, still if you do not forget God, then I shall give him so much blessing that he will be an envy of even supernatural beings. That is the interpretation of this verse. So, divine grace has a very important role to play. But to deserve divine grace, we have to play our own role. Then there is a very important principle in the philosophy of devotion that is sometimes called surrender, real surrender. So, surrender involves taking complete refuge in God. In some of the devotional scriptures, it is mentioned that even if you cannot pray to God without any selfish motive, if you are in the habit of praying to God for some secular empirical things, there is nothing wrong. You pray sincerely. After all, instead of turning to somebody else, you are turning to God for fulfilling your worldly desires. So better do that. And when you sincerely pray to God, even for worldly pleasures, of course, such devotees do not belong to the highest type. Those devotees belong to mediocre type. But in the Gita, Lord Krishna says, even such people have a place in God's empire, in God's heart. So he says, Artho Jignasir Artharthi, that 4 types of devotees are mentioned. Those who are suffering from problems, they are not interested in God, but they want to get their problems solved. So they turn to God. Nothing wrong in that. And then there are people who are interested in material comforts. They may pray to God for material comforts. All right. Now, what really happens if you really sincerely pray to God, even for material comforts? God listens to that. God fulfills your prayers. And then, when your questions are answered, when your prayers are answered by God, you develop a sense of gratitude towards God. And out of this sense of gratitude, your prayers become more intense. You start praying with less and less selfish desires. And your prayers become more and more unselfish, more and more spiritual. And slowly, God lifts you from the mediocre level of a devotee who prays for physical comforts to higher and higher levels of spirituality. And ultimately, you will start praying to God without any spiritual motive. This is the highest prayer. And when this prayer becomes possible, then the doors of divine grace opens itself. Apart from the example of Saint Teresa of Avila, which I already described, there is another example. There was a prominent Christian evangelist who was a contemporary of Mahatma Gandhi, who lived in the central provinces in India before independence, in the 40s. He fell sick, so badly he fell sick, that he started thinking of returning to England from where he came. And he went on praying, but he found that his prayers are not answered. So in his diary, in his autobiography, he writes, one night he prayed continuously the whole night. And towards the early morning, he said, "Oh God, I prayed to you so long, and you didn't answer my prayers. Now I close my bargain here. Do whatever you want." That was the last prayer. Then at that moment, divine grace starts functioning in him. And it is said that he slowly started recovering, and he continued his evangelical missionary activities in India for 25 years even later. This is another classical example of the role of divine grace. So, divine grace doesn't flow unless we become deserving of it, unless we become grace worthy. To become worthy of divine grace, we have first of all to work hard. We have to become more and more unselfish, and we have to give up the bargaining tendency. As I said earlier, we have to first work hard. As he said in the example of Saint Teresa of Avila, she says the farmer has to work very hard to prepare the soil for irrigation. Because before preparing the soil properly, if he irrigates the land, then along with food grains, weeds and undesirable vegetation also will grow in the field. So to prevent that, he has to work very hard to prepare the ground, the field for irrigation. And then also, later on, he must start thinking of some ways to bring water to the field. Water could be brought from the well, river, and so on. I already explained earlier. I already explained. But when he is ready, when through hard work and self-effort, he becomes worthy of God's grace, then it starts raining. And when the rainfall falls on the soil which is already ready for irrigation, then his life becomes spiritually fulfilled. Similarly, when you see in Brahmanandaji's reply, you can find the same idea. If God's grace comes to us without any preparation on our part, we won't be able to recognize it as God's grace. Not only that, we will not be able to make proper use of God's grace, but even we won't be able to recognize it as an expression of God's grace. So even to be able to recognize God's grace as God's grace, we must become mentally prepared. We must become spiritually ready to receive the grace of God. That is an important principle. This idea is expressed in the form of a story in one of our devotional classics. The story is taken from a Bhagavata Purana, which is a devotional classic belonging to 8th century or 7th century AD. The story is about a royal family. A king had 2 wives. Each wife had a son. But the king did not treat both the children properly. So the younger son was not properly treated. So one day he tried to climb to the lap of the king. The king's name is Uttanapada, which of course you may remember. If you are interested in reading this story directly, you can refer to the devotional classic. Its English translation is available. It's called Bhagavata Purana. There, in the 4th book, from 8 to 12 chapters, 12th chapter, in 5 chapters, there is a story of a young prince who actually reconciled in his life both self-effort and divine grace. So this boy left his palace because he was not treated properly by his stepmother and also by his father. Young boy of 5 years. And he was walking through the forest. And as he was walking through the forest, a great sage saw him from a distance. The sage was impressed. A young boy of 5 years walking through the forest. And then he came and asked him, "What's the matter with you? Where are you going? You are a small child." And he said, "My father didn't treat me properly. And then when I started crying and weeping, then my mother told me, by God's grace, you can have all your problems solved." The boy, simple boy, as I said earlier, the boy did not have any artificial layer in his mind. His mind was one. When the mother told him, if you get God's grace, all the problems will be solved. The boy completely believed him and he left the palace. It's very important. The greatest obstacle is artificial layer in our mind. Second great obstacle is sense of pride, and ego and attachment towards worldly comforts. Now, of course, if you have worldly comforts, as I said earlier, God will remove those obstacles. And if you have only one mind, then God's grace flows straight in. So this boy was walking, and this old sage, his name was Narada, he came to the boy and asked him, "What's the matter? Where are you going?" He told him his story. Then Narada this great old sage tried to test this boy. See, the boy wanted to go and meditate upon God and to receive God's grace. But this ancient sage knew that it is not as easy as words. So he wanted to test whether this small boy actually had the determination, detachment, and spiritual inclination to achieve this great goal. So he tried to test this boy. See, you are a small boy. These types of quarrels are very common in one's life. You better go back to your palace and play with your brother. These problems should not be taken seriously. But the little boy of 5 years, his name is Dhruva. The story is narrated by Sister Nivedita in a small book, The Cradle Tales of Hinduism. You can find this story described in a very graphic style by Sister Nivedita, who was a disciple of Swami Vivekananda, an Irish disciple of Swami Vivekananda. Now, when Narada found that this boy is determined, Narada tried to prevent him, but he said, "No, my mind is hurt. My mind is wounded. I won't return to the palace till I realize God and till I receive God's grace." Narada was very much happy. He was astounded. And he blessed him. And he instructed him how to continue meditation, where to go, how to sit, and how to pray. All the instructions Narada gave, the sage gave to this boy. And he went ahead. And it is said that in 6 months, he realized God. And he felt the grace of God. In fact, one famous verse which very many people quote, the prayer, the one reality who is the immanent principle in all living beings, this prayer was recited by this small boy when he had a vision of God in front of him. And he became so great, and later, by God's grace, he was received by his father and his stepmother and all his relatives, and he was highly honored. He became a well-known, a famous king in later life. So you can find, see, when the great sage tried to test him, the boy showed his determination, tenacity, and iron will. That's in spiritual life, you need a very strong will. One of the most important characteristics of an ideal devotee is a strong will. See, sandushta satatam yogi yatatma dridhanishchaya. One expression that you find in Bhagavad Gita, the 12th chapter, is Lord Krishna says that an ideal devotee should have a strong will, an iron will. Because without this iron will, a devotee will not be able to withstand obstacles. And when a devotee has this iron will, he can get fully established in the ideal of self-effort. And when he makes his own effort, then God finds him worthy of his grace. Then the wind of God's grace starts flowing, and then it becomes easy for you to cross the river of worldly life. Another classic example of the reconciliation of self-effort and God's grace is found in the life of the founder of the very organization to which we belong, Swami Vivekananda. There are two classic examples in Swamiji's life. See, as you all know, Swamiji was a very hard-working person. He was the very embodiment of self-effort. In Sanskrit, it's called Purushakara, self-effort. For all external appearances, Swami Vivekananda was a very manly person who didn't care for, externally of course, any extraterrestrial God or his grace. Swamiji was the one who declared in Karma Yoga, man is a master of his own destiny. This is one of the central theme of two lectures related to Karma Yoga, which he delivered in America. Now, before Swami Vivekananda became Swami Vivekananda, when he was a young agnostic student in Calcutta, there is an interesting incident. Swamiji had to face a lot of problems in his domestic life after the passing away of his father. His father, Vishwanath Datta, was a very wealthy lawyer, but when he passed away, he had already spent much of his wealth, and the family was in a very difficult situation financially. So Vivekananda, Narendranath Datta, as he was known at that time, was the eldest son of the family. It was his duty to look after his sisters and also his mother, aged mother. So he was in a great difficulty. And Sri Ramakrishna came to know of this. So when Sri Ramakrishna heard this from Swamiji himself indirectly, Sri Ramakrishna asked him, you go and pray to the Divine Mother in Dakshineshwar. So it was a Tuesday, night, 9 o'clock. Sri Ramakrishna told him, today is an auspicious day. You pray to Divine Mother. And Swamiji went to pray. But when he reached the temple, when he entered the shrine, it became impossible for Vivekananda to pray for material fulfillments. He forgot all about these domestic problems. He prayed only for supreme knowledge, devotion, and wisdom, spiritual wisdom. Sri Ramakrishna scolded him for forgetting his real purpose of going to the temple and asked him to go again and pray. But Vivekananda could not do that. 3 times Swamiji tried. He could never raise his mind to the level of praying for material wants. Then Sri Ramakrishna told him, look here. Sri Ramakrishna congratulated him. Inwardly he was very happy because his disciple, Narendranath Datta, who later became Vivekananda, the prophet of Vedantic philosophy, could not pray for anything other than spiritual enlightenment. But Sri Ramakrishna blessed him, your family will not have problems for most essential needs of domestic life. Now just imagine, there Swamiji made an attempt. And when he made an attempt, he understood. And this attempt is symbolic of self-effort. So at the end of self-effort, you understand the limitation of self-effort. And then you realize the true significance, the true implication of divine grace and its real role in spiritual life. If you just go and pray for spiritual wisdom, that prayer may not be sincere. So all the toil, all the struggles, all the efforts, all the miseries that we undergo, and all our attempts to solve our own problems, which may fail, convince us the limitation of self-effort. And the moment you realize the limitation of self-effort, you simultaneously realize the significance of divine grace. Otherwise, we won't understand the true significance of divine grace. Again, you find, to be able to surrender yourself completely to God and to receive divine grace, you should be very strong. It is necessary to be strong to put up self-effort. But far greater strength of mind is necessary to be worthy of divine grace and to make proper use of divine grace. Otherwise, this divine grace we will not be able to make proper use of divine grace. We won't be able to recognize divine grace as divine grace. Now, the same Vivekananda, you see, it was the end of his life. He accomplished so much. Actually, his missionary life starts in 1893, September 11. And it came to an end on 4th July 1902. Only 9 years, roughly speaking. So, Vivekananda's missionary, his universal spiritual mission lasted only for 9 years. And within 9 years, what all he achieved. And then towards the end of his missionary life, he surrendered everything to Sri Ramakrishna. He said, whatever I have achieved, I achieved by the grace of Sri Ramakrishna. That is the statement which Swamiji made. So, one important principle that you find in Swamiji's life is, he combines in his life the highest of self-effort and the highest of divine grace. So, the person who was the embodiment of self-effort also became the embodiment of the highest surrender. There is a interesting conversation in Vivekananda's works, in his conversation and dialogues. See, Swamiji himself says, time and again have I received in this life marks of his grace, God's grace, Sri Ramakrishna's grace. He stands behind and gets all this work done by me. Remember, these words are coming from a person who taught us to believe in ourselves. Swamiji exhorts his countrymen to believe in themselves. He says, in modern terms, an atheist is one who doesn't believe in himself. A theist is one who believes in himself. But then, believe in oneself here means believe in the truth that we are not this human body, we are not these psycho-physical mechanisms, we are the supreme Atman, the universal consciousness, the immanent principle, and also the all-pervading supreme reality. Now, Swamiji says, time and again I have received in this life marks of his grace. He stands behind and gets all this work done by me. When lying helpless under a tree in an agony of hunger, when I had not even a scrap of cloth for wearing, when I was resolved on traveling penniless around the world, even then help came in all ways by the grace of Sri Ramakrishna. So, just imagine, Swamiji, who taught us the ideal of self-confidence and self-effort and manliness, who defined education as a man-making mechanism, says, behind this manliness, behind this self-effort, it was the grace of God. It is grace of God who gives us the self-confidence which enables us to put up our own effort. Now, a disciple asked him a question. It's another context. Disciple asked this question: is there, sir, any law of grace? Swamiji replied, yes and no. The disciple asked the question, how is that? Swamiji said, those who are pure always in body, mind and speech, who have strong devotion, who discriminate between the real and unreal, who persevere in meditation and contemplation, upon them alone the grace of the Lord descends. If you sit in a corner in a relaxed mood, in an easy chair, and if you go to sleep, God doesn't come with His grace on a platter. We must work. So Swamiji says, we must work for attaining mental purity, purity of mind, speech, deed and word, and make all our own efforts to make spiritual progress in our life. And then God's grace descends. In another context, Swamiji says, it is God's grace that is behind all types of human advancement. When you meditate on external objects, and when that meditation turns inward, nature itself reveals its mysteries. That's how Newton could discover the theory of gravitation, or an Einstein could discover another mystery of nature. So, when we meditate upon the mystery of external world, and when we make a discovery, we call that discovery scientific discovery. And when we turn this meditative process inward and try to discover the mystery of our own existence, then you become a sage or a saint, and it is called spiritual enlightenment. But on the one hand, there is an element of self-effort. On the other hand, there is something which is beyond self-effort. Many people have tried. All do not become Newtons or Einsteins. So certain qualities, sincerity, hard work, and intense meditation, intense effort, self-effort, it forces nature to reveal its own secrets. That's how science evolves. And when the same intense meditative process is turned inward, then the God sitting within our own hearts reveals Himself. And that is called spiritual realization. So, on the one hand, you find self-effort. Self-effort is the stage of beginning. We begin with self-effort, and we end with the manifestation of God's grace. One very great, important principle behind, which guides, which is the regulating principle of Advaitic metaphysics, was articulated by a great polemical writer. You may not, many of you may not be familiar with it. It is called Khandana Khandakadya, a highly intricate dialectical polemical work by a great scholar called Sri Harsha. Mind you, he was a cutthroat Advaiti, not a devotee, not a devotional philosopher. He says, Ishvara anugraha deva pumsam advaita vasana. This is Sanskrit expression. The meaning is this: it's by the grace of God that you develop an interest even in non-dualistic philosophy. Even to be interested in non-dualistic philosophy, which formally doesn't include the idea of a formal God and God's grace, even to be interested in non-dualistic philosophy or Advaita, you should have a bit of God's grace. And the greatest of Advaita philosophers, Shankaracharya's devotional poetry is full of ideas where he says it is God's grace which enables you to go beyond the limitation of intellect and to realize the supreme transcendental truth. So, thank you. I have just tried to give a brief outline of these two apparently contradictory ideals of self-effort and God's grace. Sometimes people try to interpret these ideas in terms of will and destiny. Human will and human destiny. But actually, this interpretation is not acceptable in the light of traditional interpreters. In the light of traditional philosophy. The point is this: self-effort prepares our mind to receive, accept, and properly make use of divine grace. Without self-effort, we won't be able to really understand or make use of the grace of God. This is also the teaching of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So thank you, namaskar. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Namaste.